we will just mute the lines for a minute and we will start in just a minute or two. Okay, folks, let's get started. So I want to welcome everyone to the 5 ways to respond effectively to change reactions. This is your complimentary webinar from Title Shift. And I have a couple of housekeeping things as well as to let you know who's going to be working behind the scenes with myself. So I have with me Lauren Connor, and she's going to be your moderator today. I'd like to introduce myself to you all. My name again is Siobhan Brown, and I am the practice leader at Title Shift, formerly known as SPM Learning. I am a learning and development professional with 17 years of experience, and no, I didn't start when I was 10 years old, for those of you who are looking. I do specialize in leadership development and change management. So I want to cover a couple of logistic things for you. The microphones will be muted throughout the entire session. All questions will be handled via the question pane, which means that if you have any questions at all throughout the session, please feel free to type them into the question pane, and Lauren will be moderating them, especially if you have any technical questions. Lauren will be answering them, and throughout the session we'll be asking questions, so please feel free to type them in, and we will make sure that we get right to those. Finally, if you want to provide any feedback throughout the session, please feel free to type in your questions in the question pane, and we'll get to those too. So with that, let's get started. As I said, welcome again to the 5 ways to responding effectively to change reactions. Whenever change occurs, there's always going to be various reactions to change. For some, change can be causing fear, it can cause them anxiety, doubt, insecurity, or perhaps ambivalence. While for others, change means excitement, it means anticipating new opportunities and looking forward to a new future. And according to Arnold Bennett, the reality is any change, even a change for the better, is always accompanied by drawbacks and discomforts. So regardless of the type and magnitude or speed of the change, no matter what it is or how positive the benefits are anticipated to be for the stakeholders personally, without having a formal approach to change management that addresses staff reactions with the intent to gain commitment, the change initiative will likely fail. At the end of this session, we're hoping that you will be able to recognize different reactions to change, which also includes your own reaction to change. And you'll also be able to determine appropriate change strategies to use and the corresponding behaviors to address employee concerns regarding change. Specifically, we're going to be highlighting 5 different reactions and strategies that you can use when dealing with employee resistance. Now, although we can't address all of the concerns of everyone who is on this webinar today, I would like to tailor the session to meet your needs. So what I'd like for you to do is to please feel free to enter a key learning or perhaps relearning, because we know that many of you are already online and you have a set of skills to lead people through change, and you're probably already doing that on a daily basis. But I would really like to tailor the session to meet your needs. So to ensure that, I'd like for you just to take a moment, go into the questions pane and just type in what you would like to learn or perhaps relearn, so that by the end of today's session you would be able to walk away with something substantial. So take a minute now, go ahead, type in what it is that you would like to learn or relearn to make this session worthwhile, and I'll take the first couple of responses and we'll try to tailor the session to meet your needs. So I'm just waiting for some responses to come in. So we've got a response here by Diana, who would like to know how to recognize different reactions and how to manage them effectively. So yes, Diana, we'll definitely get to that. We also have here by Donna, how to teach managers who just don't get it. So that one's a little bit more tricky. We probably should have told them that they should have jumped on this webinar with us today, right? But we'll try to talk a bit more specifically to that later on in this session. And then how to effectively respond to a resistor. So this one is by Margaret. You know what, that's a very good question, and I think that's probably on the mind of several people who are on this call, so we will make sure that we get to those 3 today. And for the rest, I wanted you to jot that down and keep that in mind. The reason we ask this question is sort of like when you drive a car and say you want to buy a new one, and all of a sudden, so you say, I would like to get a new Honda. And then as you're driving along, you just notice that there's a whole bunch of Hondas all over the road all of a sudden. And that's because it becomes front of mind. So now that you've taken that moment to write down what it is that you're looking for throughout the session and what would be a key learning for you, you'll be looking for that response throughout today's session, and hopefully we'll be able to get that. And at the end, we'll open it up again for questions. So if I wasn't able to get to that and it's a burning question for you, please feel free to reiterate that, and we'll get to those at the end of today's session. So why can change be challenging? Well, change causes a mismatch between expectations that we thought would happen and perceptions of what we see happening. Ultimately, humans seek control, and when those expectations don't match, this is where we experience that loss of control. We adapt to change by a combination of altering the situation and revising our expectations. So what is change leadership? Well, in its simplest form, it's the process of leading individuals through a change as seamlessly as possible. Our definition for change leadership is defined as follows. It's a dynamic process that leverages strategic two-way communication. Note it doesn't say one-way communication. This is where it involves the manager speaking to their staff and they're having a dialogue. The second is that it includes engagement activities to create awareness of the change itself. And this is done by providing additional information, sharing, providing compelling facts, and in turn it inspires interest and quells any concerns from employees. The third here is it ensures readiness throughout by providing people with the skills, the training, and the provision of necessary tools. And then lastly, it helps to instill confidence through empowerment and participation. It involves careful guidance since the goal ultimately is to transition those who are impacted by the change from their current comfort zone to the desired but unfamiliar future state. Ultimately, the difference between good change leaders and great change leadership is leaders that can establish trust, they can actively endorse the change, and they visibly participate in all stages of the transition themselves. So they're not the ones that just talk, they actually walk the talk. When we look at what is a strategic approach to change leadership and what that means, it's a combination of 4 key elements. The first one being the context. So this explains the why the change is actually necessary and why it's needed. The second one is the barriers, and that is really anticipating what roadblocks need to be addressed and being able to remove those barriers to ensure acceptance, engagement, and the optimal adoption of the change. The third is the process, which determines how the change will be initiated and the approach to be taken. And then lastly, it's the people, which identify the actual human dynamics that will be involved, who will be impacted by the change, and who needs to be influenced. What aspects of the change leadership do you find most challenging? So what we're going to do is we're going to open this up to a poll, and I would like to hear from you. So you've got 4 options. We're going to be looking at context, managing barriers, people, and processes. So which of these 4 do you find is most challenging when you are leading change? So just take a minute, and I'd like for you to answer that question. So we've got about half of you have responded. That's great. Okay, so we're going to close the poll in another 10 seconds. So 5 more seconds. All right, perfect. Now we're going to close the poll and let's see the results. So we've got over 58% of you have said that people, you find, are the most challenging aspect when you're leading a change. And not surprisingly, research also confirms that too, that people tend to be the most challenging because you're dealing with a variety of change reactions and different personality types. So let's explore these change reactions in a bit more detail. Now, according to Ruth Gimmon, who was an author for the Business Journal in Ottawa, she says that there are 4 common yet distinct behavioral reactions to change. So the first one is people who thrive on change. So these are the individuals that tend to be very direct, they demonstrate results-oriented approach, they embrace change quickly, and they're usually the ones that initiate the change by challenging the status quo. Now the second group of individuals, these are the people who aren't bothered by change at all. They're the eternal optimists. They're enthusiastic, and they try to keep everyone motivated during times of flux by using their creativity to develop innovative solutions to handling change. The third group of people are those that resist change. Now these tend to need some time to prepare. They are steady decision makers, they don't like to be rushed, and many appear to just put up with the change since it may be difficult to determine how deeply they are impacted by the change until much later on in the process. And then the last group are those people who are concerned with the effects of the change. Now they are the cautious, careful, and the objective thinkers who seek to maintain the highest standards regardless of the change going on around them. So now that you've got an idea of the 4 different types of reactions that people have when it comes to change, we're going to look a little bit more in terms of recognizing resistance. And if you had identified yourself as one of those that automatically resist change, not to worry, you've got lots of company. Now, even those who embrace and thrive on change will experience some sort of resistance to change, and that's absolutely natural. The key is to try to train yourself to be more mindful of your reactions. So first, you have to recognize and acknowledge your own resistance. Are you simply resisting the change because it's your nature to do so, or is there an actual valid reason? Some people who resist change fail to look for the potential positive side of the change. They're so negative and so close-minded that they're unable to refuse or view changes objectively. So what does change resistance actually look like? Change resistance is not always as obvious as you may think. Now, typically we expect to see resistant behaviors such as criticism, lack of cooperation, and unwillingness to participate. But you also have those passive resistant behaviors, and they're not so obvious when it comes to change. And these particularly have a direct impact on stakeholders, especially when you're putting out communications towards change. However, these resistant reactions may also be passively expressed. So you've got things like people sort of agreeing verbally, but then their actions sort of show a completely different take to the change, or they withhold information sometimes. And you'll notice that these are more passive ways of dealing with the change. They're harder to detect, and they can also be a lot more difficult to address when it comes to change, because it's easy for you to find those people who are just outwardly telling you that they are resistant to the change, they don't think that this is a very good idea. You right away you know where their stand is, and you can easily speak to, or it actually is a difficult conversation, but at least you can easily recognize that they are being resistant to the change. It's the passive resistant ones are the ones that's far more difficult for you to be able to figure out what's going on, and then it requires more action on your part as a manager to sit down with these individuals and figure out what is the underlying cause of this resistance. As a leader, you're going to be responsible for mitigating the change resistance as best as possible and encouraging acceptance to the change. So first you have to be able to recognize the change resistant signs, and then you got to understand what the possible reasons are for change resistance. Sometimes it's not always work-related. There's a lot of non-work-related issues and personal issues that can be going on, which is causing them to resist to change. If someone's going through something that's very personal and difficult at home, and then you throw on some more changes for them at work, it's very difficult for them to be able to deal with all that change. After you're able to recognize the signs and then understand why people may be resisting, you need to develop possible mitigation plans to solve these change resistance reactions. And those can include such things like personal coaching, targeted communication, engagement activities, and so forth. So we're going to take a look now at what are some of the possible reasons for change resistance. And as you can see, as they are showing up here, there's many reasons why people resist change. And we're going to take a look at a few of these in a little bit more detail and then explain what are some of the mitigation strategies that you could use. Now, one of the most common resistances that we see is that the vision isn't clear. And that's the most common reason for that. The way that you can circumvent this is by explaining the purpose of the change and then communicating it often. When we say communicating it often, it usually has to be somewhere between 7 to 11 times you have to repeat yourself. People don't always hear the first time when you communicate what a great vision the change is supposed to be able to accomplish. So you have to keep reiterating it over and over again for it to actually stick. The other one is that no one has outlined what change will mean for them in practice. So you have to, as a change leader or as a direct manager and supervisors, to describe what's going to change and what's going to stay the same. People experience an enormous amount of anxiety when change is initially introduced. So to alleviate some of that stress, it's very important for you to be very specific as to what is going to remain the same and what's going to remain the same for them in their specific role. Another one of the common change resistance is that they don't stand to gain anything and they stand to lose something. The reality is when change comes in, sometimes they're going to lose something that's near and dear to them. And other times they do stand to gain something, but they just can't see what that is. So your role as a change agent is to make sure that you explain to them what are the benefits of the change, why do they need to accept this, that it's coming, and also to sort of redirect their attention to what all the really great things are. You also need to remind them gently of what the consequences are of them not changing, because they'll turn around and they'll try to stay very forceful and resist the change even more. Past experiences that people have with change, especially when it's managed poorly, can also lead them to resist change going forward. So part of your role as their change leader is to acknowledge past mistakes that may have occurred in the organization. And you have to be honest and open with this kind of conversation, because in order for them to accept the new change initiative, they need to be able to trust you as a leader, and by acknowledging the past mistakes and then showing them how you intend, or how the organization intends to move forward with the change, is probably one of the best strategies that you can use to get them on board. And you need to provide a lot of information, especially around the process and how you're going to help those individuals get through the change to the other end. Some more common reasons for change resistance also look like this. That they are in their comfort zone, which means that they don't really want to change. It's so easy to continue doing the same thing over and over again and not having to change. So your role is to sort of create some sort of disenchantment about the past and gently remind them of why we are changing into the future, as well as what's going to be the consequence if we remain the same. Yes, we can stay in this great comfort zone, but you know what? The world is changing. And if we stay here and remain in our comfort zone, we're not going to be able to adapt to what's coming next. We're not going to be able to deal with the new technologies, deal with the change in our customers and what they're asking for us to do. So that's why it's very necessary for them, for us as an organization, to change and be able to adapt to those needs. And if we don't, what we're going to find is that people will jump ship. And this is what you see where you've got companies like Apple or Google who are very innovative and constantly thinking to the future, and then they create that discomfort with what's current or in the past, and then create that whole sense of ownership with their individuals, as well as excitement to the future, so that people want to be able to move and change. Another one of the reasons that also come up very commonly and very often is a threat to skill and competence. If people feel that this new change is going to make them look stupid and make them look incompetent, they're not so willing to change, and they will resist. They won't say it's because they don't have the skill to move forward, but you'll see that they will outwardly not want to change. So what you need to do is provide training for them. Let them know what the new change is going to be and how you plan on supporting them with the actual skills through training, and then the reinforcement strategies afterwards, and that you're going to be there to help them through that process. Oftentimes, people also go through what we call change shock. So this is when there's too much change too often and they can't deal with it. They're almost overwhelmed with the amount of change that they have to deal with. So in cases like that, the best strategy for a manager is actually to speak with their team members one-on-one and find out what's going on with them, what are their concerns, what's their perspective about the change, and how they can assist to help them move through that change process more effectively. And then the last one that I want to cover is that they think that there's a better way to do the change. Ever have those team members that feel, hey, this change is not all that great. Actually, I have a much better way that we could accomplish this. I would suggest that you actually listen to these folks. Listen to their concerns and demonstrate how the change will benefit the organization. At times you may realize that they have a very valid point of something that was not considered, in which case that should be escalated. And in other times you need to gently remind them of the consequences of non-compliance. So if they feel that there's a better way of doing it, which likely may be the old way of doing it because they want to stay in their comfort zone, you have to show them the benefits of the new way of doing it with having systems and structures in place. Otherwise people will always revert back to their old ways. We do this really great exercise with a group of individuals by asking them to change and then change again and then change some more and to note all the changes that happen in between. And then when the exercise is done, we find that people just tend to go back to the way that they were before because there was no consequence to them staying that way. So if you don't have systems and structures in place, people will always go back to what they believe was the better way of doing things because they don't like being in that discomfort of change. But when you have support systems in place, that's when people feel more secure that they have the help and they have the support from the managers and other people within the organization to help maintain that change. Now, when we think about change, and if you looked at all your employees and how they've sort of handled the change, I want you to stop and think about yourself. And what are you feeling when it comes to change? Are you showing those signs of resistance? Are you an initiator of change? Are you an advocate of change? Or are you a passive resistor, like what we mentioned before? And therefore, you're not really able to lead that change as effectively as you should. You may need to become aware of your reactions to be able to successfully lead that change. As a leader, you have to understand what your personal reactions are to it, especially if you're not the one who's initiating it and you feel that resistance. Your actions as a change leader will inspire the emotions and the actions of your team members. Studies show that if a leader doesn't support a change, they increase the likelihood that their team members will also not support the change. Conversely, the opposite is true. If a leader supports the change, they will increase the likelihood that their team members will also support the change. Leading people through change is often very difficult, especially if you're not on board with the change yourself. That doesn't mean that you have to deny your feelings. It just means that you need to be able to recognize your feelings and own up to that. So what do you do if your feelings and if the way that you are responding to change is not exactly in alignment with the change itself? Do you stay passive as a resistor, or do you sort of just pretend it and fake it and jump on board? What are your thoughts on that? I'd like to see what a couple people have to say. What do you do if you don't actually support the change? I'd like to open that one up. Let's get a couple of responses to see what people have to say. So I see people here stating that they'll just support the change, some will fake it, yes. They find out more information. That's a really good one. Is it Sadia? That's a really good one. That's what you really should do, is to find more information and ask the people that are higher up how to deal with the change more effectively. Get a better understanding of why the change is happening. That's by Rudy, and that's also very correct. you should go and ask questions as to why we're changing, what are the benefits, and get a deeper understanding. Because trust me, if you are having questions with regards to your change, so are your team members. They're going to want to know what's going on, and they have a bunch of questions to answer, and you need to be able to answer those. So while they're having resistance and you're having resistance, you need to be able to go to your leaders and ask them those questions around why are we changing, what are the benefits, how can we do this, and any of those concerns that you may have, see if they can quell those concerns, because chances are your employees also have the same set of concerns too. I'm looking at another one here. It says, depends, usually support the change, but will offer my comments if I don't agree and try to understand what changes and why. You know what, Diana, that's also a really good point. I would also encourage you to be very open and honest with your employees to a certain extent. Now, you don't want to be going to the point where you're saying this change is awful, this doesn't make any sense, I don't know what they were thinking of when they came up with this, because that's also going to influence the emotions and the reactions of your team members. But to be honest with them, to say, you know what, I don't really fully understand what the change is about, but I'm going to get that information. Or that's a really good point, I don't have that information right now, but I'm committing to finding it for you. Those are all perfectly good responses that you can have, and that I would strongly urge for you to seek those responses from your leaders and then funnel it back to your staff. That way they can see that you're being open, you're being transparent, you're not denying your feelings, but you're also quelling your concerns. At the end of the day, the change is still going to go through, whether you're on board or not. And it's much better if you're on board and you're in alignment than if you're not, because it's very difficult for you to lead a change initiative if you're not in alignment with it. So thank you all for being very open and honest with how you deal with change, especially when you're not in alignment with it. Okay, so let's take a look at a model for managing transitions and change. We have to be realistic about how our employees and the organization will respond to certain changes so that we can prepare for their responses. A typical change model outlines 4 distinct changes of our change reactions: denial, resistance, acceptance, and commitment. Now, it's normal to experience all 4 stages of change. However, some individuals will move through the stages faster than others, depending on the nature of the change, their past experience, and their personal reactions to the change, whether they support it, they are neutral, or they outwardly just resist the change. So how do you feel when change impacts performance and productivity? When a change is introduced, are you jumping on board, or are you sort of sitting back to see what's happening? Now, this is totally normal change reactions, and it's often interpreted as trying to prove that there's no need for change to happen, which is why at the beginning people just sort of don't do anything at all. They want to they go through that denial stage where they're not doing anything with regards to the change, just so that they can show that we need to keep things remain the same. And that way, the old way that we do things works. But as time goes on, as it starts to dip down in terms of productivity, the productivity will reduce a little bit because of the new changes being introduced, and then their productivity tends to sort of skyrocket with the new change, and then it'll level out as they go through the change process. I'd like to take a moment and sort of go through the 4 different steps of the change process. And this is adapted by William Bridges, who recognizes the stages of the transition process. The endings, that's what part of the resistance when a change is over, the neutral zone, which is acceptance of the change, and then lastly a new beginning. So this is where you sort of become committed to the change. Initially, when any change starts off, people go through the denial mode. So this is the stage where they lack acceptance of the change, they deny that there will be any positive impact of the change, and they kind of want to just keep acting as though nothing had happened, sort of sticking their head in the sand in that way, using old practices and processes, sometimes very deliberately in that sense, and just ignoring any evidence or information that's contrary to their belief system. Then after they sort of see, things are moving, they kind of move into this resistance mode. So this is where they don't really want to accept the change, but they know it's coming. And the challenge is that these individuals are unable to adequately picture the future. So this is where it's really important for you to reiterate what the vision is and why we are changing. Then we move into what we call the acceptance or the neutral zone. So this is where people are experimenting with the idea of a new change, and will begin to implement any necessary actions to move into commitment. So at this stage, they're sort of exploring the benefits of the change and what they will gain from jumping over into the acceptance of the change. Then we move into the last phase, which is what we call commitment or new beginning, and this is where people now embrace the change. They're no longer in that confusion, disoriented state like they were in the resistance. They're now more happy. You can see that they're involved in the process. They're facilitating the change. They're speaking to others about how great it is, and they've committed to a new vision of where the organization is going. So I also want you to note that if you go through this change curve too quickly, so you know those people that we were talking about who sort of just jump on board, yay, the change is really great, and sort of move with it too fast, if that means they've kind of gone through the denial phase a lot quicker than normal, what ends up happening is that they regress, and then they end up going back to perhaps the resistance mode and then back acceptance to commitment. So it's really important that everybody goes through all of those 4 stages, but we don't want them to get stuck and sticking in that resistance for too long. That's when we have a problem, and as change leaders, we have to go in and manage those behaviors. When organizational values and individual values are both clear and congruent, individual commitment to the goals of the organization are significantly higher. So this is according to Blessing White's article, The 3 C's of Change. To embrace change, individuals need to perceive this as a purposeful change, or what we call progress, and not simply just more change on top of more change. They need to personally associate or relate the change and view it as a benefit on 2 fronts. 1, the change needs to be a benefit to the organization and an embracing of the company's espoused values. And 2, the change needs to be a change for the better by allowing them to contribute and find fulfillment at work. So if these 2 benefits are not present, it's going to be very difficult to get employee buy-in. So let's get to the crux of this. What is it that we need to do in order to get employee commitment? So we're going to take a look now at 5 different ways to gain employee commitment to change. The first one is to give people information. So you need to be as open and honest about the change as possible. You need to provide people with facts. You need to don't give them overly optimistic speculations. Share the vision and the urgency of the change. This is going to build trust. It's going to build confidence in you as a leader. And the last thing you want to do is set unrealistic expectations. You need to develop a communication strategy that's going to ensure information is disseminated effectively and efficiently and as comprehensively to everyone. We can take the proactive approach to communicating change by assessing our stakeholders. So first, you want to clarify the type and the impact of the change and what it may have on the stakeholders, which are your employees, other departments, other processes in the organization, etc. And then understand how the stakeholders are going to respond to the change. This is going to help you to do a couple of things. It can help you to determine the impact of the change will have. You'll be able to identify the amount of influence the stakeholders will have in promoting the success of the change. You'll be able to anticipate how much resistance that you're likely to encounter. You'll understand stakeholder readiness to the change, and you'll also be able to understand what actions you need to take to build commitment. And then by doing all of this, you'll be able to create what we call a stakeholder management plan and a communication strategy to get the change out. So here's an aside note. Did you know that managers who communicate change effectively can actually improve their direct reports' performance by as much as 29.2%? So this is according to the Corporate Leadership Council in 2009. Therefore, it's really, really important to communicate the vision of the change up front and early to demonstrate a need for the change and begin building that excitement and momentum to move people into action. So after we've given people all this information, what do we need to do? We need to speak to the team members directly. So what this involves is not letting that rumor mill sort of take over. You have to start by telling everyone at the same time. So I would suggest calling a team meeting. You let everybody know what the change is about, let everybody know what the vision is, and be very upfront. Same thing, all the principles that we talked about in number 1. Then you're going to follow up individually with each of your team members by having interviews to create that personal strategy for how to handle the change. This is going to help you as a change leader identify personal values and deal appropriately with the individual reactions to change. It's also going to provide you with more insight on how to understand individual reactions to change and then select the most appropriate response based on individual personal styles. So I want to explore what I say when I talk about personal styles a little bit deeper. So we use a model called DISC, and some of you may already be familiar with the DISC profile. The DISC theory, which was introduced and developed by William Martson, it's been around for well over 60 years, and it's based on a 4-quadrant model style where it describes human behavior in a very easy, simplified manner, and it offers the following model to explain the way that people react to change. So first we got to figure out, well, which style are you? So let's go over what the 4 styles are very high level, and then you're going to determine which one is your style. So if you tend to be more proactive, then you would be in the top 2 quadrants. So these are people who are more active. You tend to be more fast-paced, you're assertive, you're dynamic, and you're bold. You will tend to be more extroverted. You're going to be on the top 2 quadrants, whether either a D or an I. If your personality style tends to be that of someone that is more introverted, so you're more thoughtful, you're more moderate in your pace, you're calm, you're more methodical, you also are more careful in your decision making. That's not to say that you're not careful in your decision making if you're, a D or an I. You just tend to be a little bit more slower in your decision making. You'll likely be a C or an S. So now we got to determine which one of the 2 are you. So on the left-hand side, if you tend to be more logic-focused, more task-orientated, more questioning or objective or skeptical when you're reviewing information, then you'll likely be more of a D or C. And if you are on the other side, more people-focused, more accepting, more accommodating, you're more empathetic and more agreeable or receptive, you'll be more of an I or an S. So if you're in the top 2 of the quadrant and then to the left, you would likely be what we refer to as a D, which is dominant. If you're in the top but more to the right, that you're more people-focused and proactive, you'd be what we call an influence or an influencer. And then in the bottom, if you are more an introvert, yet you are also people-focused, you'd be what we refer to as steadiness. And then lastly, if you are what we would say someone's more introverted, but yet you're still very task-orientated, you'd be what we refer to as conscientious. So now I'd like to just do a quick poll to see who we have online and what style do you say that you most predominantly represent. This does not mean that you don't represent all 4 styles, because the truth is you actually are a combination of all 4. But when under stress, you're going to tend to exhibit one of the 4 characteristics a little bit more. So we're going to open up the poll, and I'd like for you to let me know which one of these 4 styles you tend to more predominantly represent. So we've got just about half of you have responded. All right, so I can see the bars are moving. Which of the 4 styles do you predominantly represent? Again, that does not mean that you don't have all 4, because you do. You just, under stress, you will tend to exhibit one of the 4 more often. But honestly, when you're at work, you'll sort of go in and out of all 4 of those depending on the situation and who you're talking to and what you're dealing with. Okay, so we're going to give you 5 more seconds, and then we're going to close the polls. All right. So we're going to show you the results, and it appears that we have a bit more of the influencers online. So you are the folks that tend to be more inspirational, you're more of the take a lot of initiative, you are very interactive with those, so when change is introduced, you'll be that group that tends to jump more on board and show a lot of enthusiasm as it relates to the change and a lot of excitement, and be the ones to rally people in when it comes to change. So when we talk about how can we, or how should you adopt your approach to engage each of the 4 different DISC behaviors, with the I group, we need to let this group, they need to talk through the change and ask questions. They want to be involved in the change more often. You need to listen and ask for feedback and give the I group a lot more opportunities to celebrate the success of the change. They also like to be involved in the process of facilitating people to get on board with the change. So when you're speaking to this particular group of individuals, you want to make sure that you're involving the I's and the influencers when it comes to the change initiative. Now, for the D folks, which are the dominant, we had about 24% of you. When it comes to change and you're dealing with this group, you need to be more fast-paced when you're delivering the change to them. They're going to want to know what the change is, when do they need to do it, what needs to be involved, and they also tend to be more of the drivers when it comes to change. So if you can involve them in that process and have them sort of lead it, they will be all over that. So we just keep that in mind. They also like to give milestones for long-term change, so they will like to give the results and they like to know how things are progressing along the line. So you just need to be very direct with this group and let them know what's happening. The D's and the I's are very different than the S and the C's when it comes to change. So let's go through with the S's. So they're the group that's very complete opposite to the D's. Whenever change occurs, they will tend to be more passive resistant when it comes to the change. They may seem like they're on board, but they may not necessarily be. That doesn't mean that they're resisting the change. It just means that they need to know that it's been thought through, that you provided them with all the facts with regards to the change, that you can answer their questions, you can quell their concerns, and that you've really demonstrated that you have systems in place to support the people through the change. If you can't demonstrate that to somebody who is a high S, that's where you're going to see that resistance coming into play. So it's really important that you explain the why to them. And you may need to explain that several times over. So just keep that in mind if you're their direct manager. You have to reiterate what the benefits of the change are and what's going to stay the same for them, because they tend to like status quo. So if things are changing, especially a lot of rapid change, they need to know what's going to remain the same. And they also would need some time to sort of process the change. So if it's possible to give them that time, they're going to greatly appreciate it. Now the last group is the C group. So we had about, let's see, 30% of us online were part of the C group. There's actually only about 6% that were as the S group. So this group, they tend to be more factual, detail-orientated, so you need to give them the facts. Let them know what's happening and all the details, and they're very logic-minded, so they want to see the process. How's this change going to roll out? What's involved in it? Have you thought through the impacts of this on the organization, to the bottom line? So be prepared when you have a conversation about the change with the C folks that you're going to have to be doing a lot of explanation and being able to answer their questions. That doesn't mean that they're resistant to the change, it just means that they want to know that everything's been thought through. Very similar to the S group. You have to help them with the rationale and be very tactful and non-emotional when you're giving them the information with regards to the change. So now that we have an idea of how to deal with the different groups as it comes to change, and we've sort of covered over the 4 different areas, and I believe that was one of the questions that was asked, how do you deal with change reactions. Now we also need to address another issue, which is how do we acknowledge the losses? Wherever there's change, directly or indirectly, there's usually going to be some sort of loss. And a loss is either a loss of a function, a loss of access, a loss of space, perhaps even a loss of a job. And for those who lost a job, it also means loss of coworkers for those that are still remaining. Keep in mind that this is a very difficult time for people, especially when they're losing their jobs. And for those that are remaining, you have to acknowledge that loss to them. Actually, one of the most difficult changes for people to lose is the loss of their job space, because if they're being moved from one area to another, people tend to take their stuff very personal, so you need to keep that in mind, and that's a real loss for them, especially if you're downsizing from an office to perhaps a cubicle. That is extremely difficult for people to be able to deal with. So you need to acknowledge that loss to them, and don't sweep it under the rug, because that's actually going to cause them additional more anxiety and more resistance to the change. So to help to reduce some of that anxiety and build commitment to the change, we strongly suggest to identify what are all the things that are going to remain the same and what might replace the loss. Loss is easier to cope with if there's something to replace it, so always keep that in mind. And this is going to help alleviate some of those potential fares. Number 4 in 5 ways to gain commitment is to give people time. Now, we all know that every time we introduce change and things are always moving so rapidly, sometimes you can't give them time. But the problem with that is when change is too much and too fast, people feel overwhelmed. So wherever it's possible, give individuals an opportunity to express their concerns and share their views. So if you have a team meeting, bring everybody together and allow them to express how they're feeling about the change. Just ask them. The I's are going to definitely want to explain how they're feeling, and they're going to be very open about it. The S's and the C group that we were talking about, the conscientious group and the steadiness group, they're going to be a little bit more quieter in a group like that, so you're going to have to ask the question again individually to them. And the D's, they'll be very direct and very open, and they'll let you know right off the bat exactly what's on their mind and how they feel about the change. So once you have that information, as a leader, you can show support for the decision-making of the organization, but you can also coach personally each of your team members and counsel them and give them the information as appropriate to help them through the loss of the change and to provide them with reassurances that this is a good idea and that the change is well thought through to help relieve some of that apprehensions that they may be feeling. Now, the last of the 5 ways to gain commitment is to evaluate systems and structures. People are always going to revert back to old habits if there's no consequence to remaining the same. Systems and structures need to be reevaluated and aligned with the change to ensure that the desired behavior will be sustained. Now, in a recent published book called Change or Die by Alan Dutchman, it explained that why the odds are 9 to 1 that individuals will not alter their behavior even when faced with the likelihood of dying prematurely as a result of bad habits. So with that being said, it's far more likely that people are going to go back to their old ways unless you have support systems that are in place that encourage and reward the desired behavior. If the rewards are actually in place that reward the behavior to remain the same, even though you have set up the processes and you train people to do it, they're not going to, because the reward systems and structures are not aligned with the change. So you really do have to make sure that you go back and make sure that that's in place. Without that, the change will never be maintained, and it's never going to be sustained going forward. So that's one of the key things I need you to take away from this. So your role as a change leader is to use strategies to reduce resistance among staff and gain commitment to the change. So this is going to be done by giving people information on a timely basis, by sharing the vision of this exciting new future, but not being overly optimistic, and it will aid in building trust and a sense of security with them. You need to speak to team members directly as a group and then individually to create a personal strategy for handling the change. Involve people in the process and assess teams' readiness for change as well as anticipate employee reactions. Then acknowledge the losses and identify what remains the same to help alleviate fares. Give people the time to deal with multiple changes. It takes time to let go of the past and move on to the desired future. So take the time to invest to build the commitment to the change. This may involve consulting, negotiating, and offering support as well as training. And then lastly, evaluate the systems and the structures. If they're not aligned with the change, people are going to revert back to their old habits, and the desired behavior is never going to be sustained. Equally important is demonstrating that you as a leader believe in that change. The sooner that you can align your support with the change, the easier it's not going to be for you, but also for the organization. Without your support, it's going to be very difficult for you to lead that change. So I'd like to leave you with one last thought before we open it up to questions, is that people always still tend to revert back to their old habits if there's no consequences to remaining the same. Systems and structures need to be reevaluated and realigned, and I can't stress that enough to get that desired behavior to be sustained. And if not, then people are going to willfully play ignorant for their own self-interest, especially if they view the change as something that's bad, like this comic episode of the famous Calvin and Hobbes. So here we've got Calvin and Hobbes where they're talking about it's true, Hobbes, ignorance is bliss. Once you know things, you start seeing problems everywhere. And once you see problems, you feel like you ought to try to fix them. And fixing problems always seems to require personal change. And change means doing things that aren't fun. And I say phooey to that. But if you're willfully stupid, you don't know any better, so you can keep doing whatever you like. The secret to happiness is short-term stupid self-interest. We're headed for the cliff. I don't want to know about it. Ah! I'm not sure I can stand so much bliss. Careful. You don't want to learn anything from this. So as you can see from Calvin and Hobbes, when you're going through the change, if there's no real consequences, people will be willfully stupid. And I'm sure many of you on the call right now know of those individuals who pretend to not know just so they continue to do the old behaviors that you're trying to change. The fact is, whenever change is introduced, things do need to be fixed, and people will be looking to fix, and it will require a personal change from those individuals. And we do want to be able to learn something from the change and acknowledge how things were done in the past and how things are going to be done in the future. So I thank you for your time and your participation, and we'd like to open it up now for any questions. We've got about 6 minutes left, so if anybody has any questions that they would like for me to answer, we'd like to open that up to you right now. So take a few minutes. Feel free to open up those. The polls are open. So we have a question here. You're wondering, by Jacqueline, you're wondering if the change process can become a big hindrance. Well, Jacqueline, the change process can become a big hindrance if it is not aligned with the change that you're trying to accomplish and you don't have systems and structures in place, as well as if the change process isn't really thought through. So this is where you have those resistors sort of come online, and they tend to not want to be, well, they won't jump on board unless you've demonstrated to them that the change needs to take place. One of the things that I found works really well is having a conversation with the change resistors. So you can openly ask them, why are they resisting the change and what are their thoughts and feelings about the process. Oftentimes they will tell you things that you may not have thought through. So that when you go back to provide more information about the vision, I would also suggest addressing what those resistance points were in the process. Let people know, you know what, according to Jacqueline, she had openly let me know that this is why she was resisting the change, or this was wrong in the process. And what we've done to address this is, and then you sort of speak about that, so that those people who are resisting openly, they can see that you're actually now addressing what are some of those issues. If you are unable to do that, they're going to still stay resistant. But keep in mind, too, whenever anybody says something openly that they resist the change, it's very difficult to move them over to being a supporter. The best you might be able to do then is go into that neutral zone, because people don't want to admit that, yes, they were wrong about something openly. If they didn't say anything out loud, you could probably move them from being a neutral party to a supporter. And when they resist openly, very few of them are going to turn around later and say, oh, this was a really great change idea. But by acknowledging their concerns and addressing what the process was, you can sort of see that it's been thought through and you'll gain more commitment that way. Let's see, what else do we have? Where is there a resistance to change and difficult to personally speak to each individual smaller group? This one was by Nicole. Sorry, I'm trying to read this. Where there is resistance to change and difficult to personally speak to each individual smaller groups. I'm not sure if that was a comment or more of a question, but whenever there is sort of resistance to change and you speak to them as a whole group, some will pipe up and some won't. So my suggestion with that is to speak individually with them. And sometimes that's not always an easy thing depending on your personality type. if you tend to be one of those people that, let's say you're an S person, that you like everything being status quo and very steady, and now they've introduced this whole new change and you're leading a group of individuals, and one of those team members happens to be a D member, which is actually the exact opposite, then you're going to have a more difficult time preparing for that conversation. So my suggestion would be to go in and let them know this is what the change is, this is what we plan on doing, being very direct and very open with them, and be prepared of what likely that conversation, how it's going to go. Be prepared that they're going to want to drive the change, that they're going to come very forceful with you, and they're going to be asking, why are we doing this? What's the vision looking like? And so be prepared to answer those questions. The whole point of us showing what the 4 different personality styles is so that you can get a feel of what your team members, how they react to change, and how you can adapt your communications to be able to deal with them. For some, it's going to be easier than others. If they have the same personality style as you, that's an easy one. When they have the complete polar opposite personality style to you, that's where it gets a little bit more tricky. So my suggestion is to always prepare in advance before you have those conversations and know what's the likelihood that they're going to come at you, or some of the types of questions that they're going to ask, so that you can be able to quell those concerns and yet instill some excitement towards the change. Okay, I think that's it for the questions. So again, I would like to reiterate that I appreciate all of your participation and your time. Thanks very much for your participation, and I hope that you've all enjoyed the 5 ways to effectively respond to change reactions. If you have any questions at all, please feel free to email me at siobhanbrown@titleshift.ca. After the session is done, you will receive an email with a recording of today's webinar. You should receive that tomorrow. And if you missed anything, you can go back to that recording. You will also receive further information on future webinars within the series. So with that, I want to thank you and have a really great rest of the day.